And, I say it every week, I hope we've been putting these into effect, because otherwise they don't really do anything for us. They're like exercises that you can talk about, but if you don't go to the gym and do it, it won't make much of a difference in your life. The way I thought about it is, if this is not going to work for you guys who are not coffee drinkers, but for those of you who are, this will be painfully clear. If you wake up in the morning, it's a long night, you're groggy, you kind of got that one eye open thing going on, and you're slippering into the kitchen, and you can barely see, and I'm standing in your kitchen, and you don't know why I'm standing there, but I'm standing there. It works for the story. And I say, here, look, I have a cup of coffee for you. I poured it. And I tell you that this cup of coffee, it's going to wake you up. If you have one sip of it, your eyes will open a little bit. And I tell you that it tastes, I put a little sugar in it for you, a little bit of milk. It's got a little bitter, but it's a little bit sweet. I even maybe let you smell it. And then the minute that you reach for it, I kind of pull it away from you. Now, you probably would say, first of all, what are you doing in my kitchen? Secondly, why are you pulling away my coffee? And I could say to you, well, you know about the coffee, right? You know that it tastes good. You know that it's going to wake you up. You know that it's going to warm you inside, so isn't that good enough? And surely you would look at me and say, no, that's not good enough at all. I don't care that I know that the coffee is good. I need to drink it, and I need to taste it. I need to know the benefits of it, not just in my head, but in my actual body. And the spiritual practices, these disciplines, are meant to do just that. They're meant to be the things that we drink of. Jonathan Edwards, in a sermon once, I stole my coffee example, he called it honey, and he said it's one thing to know that honey is sweet. It's another thing altogether to taste of its sweetness. And so that's what these practices are meant to do. Now today, the practice that we're going to look at is, in my mind, by far and away the most frustrating practice. And I'm almost guaranteeing that you guys are going to leave here today frustrated at me, or maybe you, God, and if you're at me, that's fine too. Because the discipline that we look at today is about guidance. And I'm going to say you're going to leave a little frustrated, because I'm not going to be able to give you the clear-cut answers if you want guidance in your life about something. So for example, if you're thinking about job A versus job B, you're not going to get the answer from the sermon. If you're thinking about, should I marry person A or person B, you're not going to get the answer from this particular sermon. Yet, David here tells us an enormous amount about guidance and about the discipline of guidance, and how you and I, if we want guidance in our life about decisions, about direction, this is the way that we do it. We do it the David way. We do it the gospel way. Let me give some context, because this psalm, it can seem like it's a little bit all over the place. Let me give you context really quickly. This is David, and he's probably towards the end of his life, definitely an older man, writing this psalm, because he talks about the sins of his youth. And if you know the life of David, he had a lot of sins, a lot of really big sins. We talked a couple weeks ago about him and Bathsheba and the adultery. We talked about having a child that died. We talked about him sending Uriah, his soldier, off to die. So David himself he had committed murder. And then not only that, but then David with Absalom was driven out of Jerusalem. So here's David, sort of an older man. You can kind of see him writing a song to God. And he's reflecting back on his life, but more importantly, he's in the midst of enormous conflict. And he looks at God and he says, God, I need to know which direction to go. He says, this Psalm's, all it says is paths, your way. Teach me your way, teach me your path. It's David, just like you and me, saying, God, there's a couple directions I can go with my life right now. And I need to know the right one. Now, what's frustrating about this is that David doesn't really come to any conclusions. He doesn't have an answer for you necessarily today, whether you should take job A or job B, or whether you should stay in Seoul or move, or whether you should marry this person or not marry this person, because it's not that he's looking for the guidance, but rather he teaches us something about the guide himself. The psalm helps us see the guide and how we can get guidance. So here, if you guys have something, you're going to write this down at the end of the message, so prepare your minds. I want you to start thinking about something, anything, that you need guidance on in your life right now? Because I want this to be very practical for us. Yes, it's theological, yes, it's spiritual, but it also is, the Bible's infinitely practical. So I want you to start thinking about something that you need direction on in your life, something that you want guidance on from God, and I want you to kind of hold it. Hold it in your brain for a little bit as we explore what the discipline of guidance looks like. What is Christian guidance first? And I gotta say this, and I know there's some people, this is gonna sound obvious to most of you, what I'm about to say. But you gotta bear with me because there's some people in this room that what I'm about to say is not completely obvious. What we first see in this psalm is that there is a path for you. If you notice in verse 4 and 5, David says, he's basically saying, show me your path, teach me your way. He's not saying, if you have a way, God, if you have a path. No, he's very, very sure that there is a path. He doesn't know which one it is just yet, but he knows that there is a path. And this, again, this sounds very obvious to some people, but you have to know that in your life right now, if you follow the God of the Bible, there is a definitive path for you. He's got something laid out for you. Specifically, you're not an accident. Not all of life is causation and accidents. It's not cause and effect. And this seems like an obvious thing, but Paul works this out even better. If you were to look in Ephesians 2, verse 10, chapter 2, verse 10, Paul finishes David's thoughts. See, David says, show me your ways. I know they're out there. I know they're there. I can't see them, but I know they're there. He's absolutely confident of it. Paul is just as confident, and Paul in Ephesians 2, verse 10 says, for we, meaning us, are his God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Paul uses this word workmanship, and I love it, because it's a Greek word that is poema. And if you know your English, that's where we get our word poem. So what Paul's saying to us today, what David's saying, but what Paul finishes, he says, listen, do you not realize that you are the very poem of God? You were written. No two poems are alike, but there's a definitive meter and rhyme and verse to every poem. And he says, he literally uses the word poem. He says, don't you know you are God's poem? He made you. And because he made you, there is a path for you. There's something specific that you have to do, that he wants you to follow on. It's not an accident. No poems are accidents. All poems are beautiful works of art that are labored over, that are cherished. And you know me, I'm not an artist. I used to write poetry when I thought I could do it. I don't think I have the skill anymore. I never really did. I don't make anything. My wife's saying I do have the skill for poetry, so maybe I need to write more poems. I don't make art. I'm not an artist. And if you follow me on Facebook, you know that I'm so proud of my new little bench that I made for my daughter, and the table and the chair, because it's like the first time in my life I've ever made something. And I post it on Facebook, and I want people to come over and see it, and it makes me feel so great when somebody says, this is beautiful, how'd you make this? And okay, it's easy, no big deal. And never mind that they know that I labored on it, but let me tell you this, I am infinitely more proud of that workmanship than you will ever be. Why? Because that's my poem. I made that. There's something to it. I know every way it was constructed. I know every nut and bolt that went into those little benches and chairs. And of course, so then I'm going to be infinitely prouder of it than you will ever be. Do you not realize that God says the same thing of you and me? He says, do you not realize that I know every nut and bolt in your life? You're my poem. You're my snowflake. You know snowflakes? When they come down, they all look the same. But if you captured two of them, of course, and you put them under a microscope, you see that they're intricately formed, infinitely and intricately formed in a beautiful manner, all unique and different. Because you're a poem, there's a path. He says, you're my workmanship, and there's good works for you to do. Now, that's the part. See, I started with the poem and the snowflake to get you feeling warm and fuzzy. So I want you to feel warm and fuzzy, you're God's poem. Isn't that nice? That's nice. Because I'm about to go into something that's going to really get you mad, not mad, hopefully you don't get mad and storm, but you get you a little frustrated. See, that was the assurance of guidance. There is an assurance, there's a promise of it. But there's also the means of guidance. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. And I'm going to try to explain this with a story in a second. Bear with me. But if you look here, look back at the Psalm 25 if you have it open. Do you notice that David never comes to any conclusions? He sits there and he says, God, I know there's a path. I know you have a path, and I know you're good. Now show me your path. But at the end of the psalm, David doesn't go, there's the path, thank you. David doesn't say, yes, job A, that's the one I should take. David doesn't say, yes, person B, that's the person I should marry. Thank you, God, for calling me your snowflake in your poem. There's my path. Thank you. He doesn't come to any conclusions. Why? If you look in verse 12 and 14, there's a hint. Because David isn't so much concerned about the guidance as he is about the guide. There's a quote from Sinclair Ferguson that I put in your bulletins. I didn't put in the outline. That's my fault. But he says, listen, the point of the Christian life, if you're seeking guidance, you're going in the wrong direction. Yes, you got to say, Lord, teach me your paths, but more importantly, David says, listen, I want to fear you first. He says, first fear God, meaning give him respect and awe. Then he'll show you the paths. He says, first find friendship with God. Then he'll show you the path. Do you realize how radically counterintuitive this is to our prayer lives? We go to God and say, show us the path. David says, I go to God in awe and wonder of who he is first. And then he'll show me the path. For David, the guidance comes second to the guide. Let me give you an example of this, okay? Now you're in a town you don't know, you're driving around, and it's very, very dark, and you get lost, okay? Instantly, I can tell by your eyes that some people can relate to being lost in a town that they're not familiar with. You're driving around, and you see somebody at the corner who's a local, looks like a local, and you say to them, you pull over and you say, listen, I need some guidance. I'm going to place A, to this place. Do you know how to get there? And the person says, of course I know how to get there. It's a little complicated, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw you a map. Say, okay, draw me a map. So I start drawing you a map, and it's this road, and it's that road, and it's complex, and there's over the hill, and under the bridge, and through the woods, and then, you're to grandmother's house you go, and you're waiting for the map, and then finally the person just looks at you and says, you know what? I'm going that way anyway. Why don't I just get in with you, and I'll take you there. And if you're a trusting sort, and you let strangers in your car, you'll let the person in your car. Why? Because the guide is infinitely better than the guidance. Having the person's voice next to you, telling you which direction to go, and hearing that voice, rather than staring at an abstract map, a map that's probably too complex for you to understand anyway, is so much better, is it not? And the irony of all ironies is that if you do let that person in your car, and you do say, guide me, you're still lost. You have no idea where you're going, but do you care? No. The person says, okay, go about 50 meters and take a right turn. You have no clue where you're going, but you don't care. The person says, go another 100 meters and take a left turn. And you still have no clue where you're going, but you don't care. Why? Because you have the guide. And David here says, listen, first I will fear, and first I will make friends with this God. I want the guide. I want the map maker, not just the map. So I told you that was going to be a little frustrating, because I'm not giving you answers yet, and I know I'm not giving you answers. We'll get to the answers in a little bit. Just hold on. Bear with me. It's so much better to have the guide than the guidance, and that's what David says. First seek that. Now, how do you do this? Because if you're anything like me in my prayer life, if it's job A or job B, or if it's person A or person B, or if it's city A or city B that I have to decide between, I go to God and I say, God, I know you're good. I know you have a path for me. Just show me the path. Make it easy. And David says a couple things here, very practically, how you and I can shift our view from the map to the map maker, from the guidance to the guide himself. And he does it in a few ways. First, and they're not easy. Nothing ever worth it is gained easily. Here they are. Let me go through them, 3 quick ones, and I'll parachute through them quickly. Verse 5, he says, first lead me in your truth. And by truth, David, as anybody in the Old Testament would say, the truth of God was always his word. Now, I know I told you it wasn't going to be easy, because what I'm telling you, you're saying, great, the pastor's now telling me I have to read my Bible more. Big surprise. I know. It's tough. Let me put it this way. I don't know French. I can't speak it. I don't know anything. I just know I like the way it sounds. Is it not a beautiful language? And some of you speak it because you're very intelligent, so don't look down on me. But I can't speak French, okay? I can't discern. I can't tell the difference. If you're speaking in French and you're talking about a cow or a banana, I can tell. I can't tell where one sentence ends and one sentence really begins. I can't discern it. In the French language, I have no guidance because I don't know it. I just know that it sounds beautiful. Now, let's pretend that I want to get some guidance in the French language. I want to have discernment. I want to be able to discern between the cow and the banana. I don't know why I chose those two words. Totally unrelated. The cow and the banana. And I want to know the difference between the two. So what I do is I go down to my store and I pick up a French-English dictionary. And then I say, you know what I'm going to do for about 5 minutes every morning? I'm going to open it up and be inspired by the French language. 5 minutes every morning, I'll open it up, I'll be inspired. And then I'll close it and I'll go about my day. And then that's the way I'll be able to discern the French language. I'll be able to learn it that way. And of course, if you were sitting next to me, if you were in my kitchen and you saw me do that, you would say, impossible. How do you think 5 minutes every morning of inspiration is going to discern the language of the French country to you? And it's the same way with God's truth in His Word. The only way to know the voice of the guide, if you let Him in the car with you, the only way to hear His voice is to throw yourself into His Word. I know it's not maybe what you want to hear this morning in terms of answers and guidance, but this is the truth. He says, first, Lord, teach me your truth, meaning let me be immersed, not just inspired. Verse 7 and 8 is the second point, and he says this. He starts to confess his sins. And he says that the people who are humble will be taught, basically. And the word humble here, it doesn't mean low self-esteem. No, it means, the better translation would be teachable. He basically says, those who are teachable will be taught. Those who confess their sins. Now, at first glance, you're looking at this saying, what do confessing sins have anything to do with getting spiritual directional guidance in your life? And I believe, and I'm reading into this is my opinion, this is not necessarily from the text. I'm reading into this because if David is an old man, he's probably at the point of his life saying, you know what? I give up control. I give up the very idea that I can control the paths of my life. He's probably looking back at his youth and looking back and saying, I was such a control freak. You remember David in his youth? You remember the story with Bathsheba? Go back and read it, 2 Samuel. He's a control freak. Such a control freak that to cover up his own mistakes, he goes out and he sends Uriah out to die, the husband. He's an absolute control freak. But here, in the moment of his life, when he's trying to make a crucial decision, he's humble and he's teachable. And he's able to follow God even when he doesn't necessarily agree with it, because he knows his limits. He knows that he was a control freak in his youth, and he knows that he has to get that up. Let me give an example here, and it's a little story. And I'm blessed by my wife introducing me to such great literature and things of life that I would never have found on my own. And this is one that I talked about last year, and a couple of people approached me asking me about this book. And you could find it. It's a very famous one. They wanted to know. It's a book by George MacDonald, and it's the story of the Princess and the Goblin. He's a Christian writer. And this is the best example of what I can say about being teachable and following the path that God has for you in your life. In the story, there's a princess and there's goblins, of course. It's a fairy tale. And the princess, the king sends the princess, this little girl, to a castle because the goblins want to come from underneath the earth. They're digging holes and tunnels, and they want to kidnap the princess. And so she's locked away from the goblins. Never go outside, never go to the mountain, never go into the mountain. Right? And in the story, because it's a good, respectable fairy tale, there's a fairy godmother. You know, what fairy tale doesn't have a fairy godmother? You have to have one. But in this one, she's called the grandmother. And she lives up in the attic. And she's there time to time when the little princess wants to find her. Sometimes she's not there, sometimes she is there. And the grandmother in the story says this to the princess. She says, listen, whenever you're in trouble, and you need to escape and you don't know where to go, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to give you a ring, and you can tie a string around that ring, and you can put the ring under your pillow, and you have to follow the string. You have to follow the thread, and it'll take you to me, to safety. Now the princess is overjoyed. She's like, oh, great, okay, good. Next time the goblins come or something, I'll do that. And then fast forward in the story, the goblins come. She hears a noise, which in any fairy tale means get running. She takes the ring with the string and she puts it under her pillow and she starts following the thread and following the thread. But instead of taking her up to the attic directly, the thread takes her out of the castle, and it takes her into the dark night, and it takes her to the mountainside, and it takes her into the mountains where the goblins live. And she said she can't see the thread. All she can do is feel it. It's so dark. And she's feeling it. And she's following the thread. And she says, I must follow my thread. I must follow my thread. And she gets to a point where there's rocks. And she starts pulling away the rocks. And behind it is a little boy named Curdy, who had been buried in. He was hiding from the goblins. And Curdy looks at her and says, how did you ever find me? And the princess says, I simply followed my thread. And so Curdy stands up, and he's the opposite of teachable. He's the opposite of humble. And he says, then let's go back. Let's go. Get away from here. And she says, it doesn't work like that. You can't go backwards. You can only go forwards. And he says, but don't you know, that'll take you into the deep, dark place, right into the danger. She says, I must follow my thread. I must follow my thread. See, the princess is teachable. The princess is humble. She says, I don't know where this is going, and I know it doesn't look so great, but I have to follow my thread. Curdy says, you're insane, you're absurd, what are you doing? And she said, but I must follow my thread. And in verse 21 and 22, David, the way he sums it up, he says, not only do you have to throw yourself into the truth, to listen, if you want to hear God's voice, you have to know what it sounds like. 5 minutes a day won't do it. Throw yourself in it. Not only that, but he says you have to be teachable. You have to be able to follow the thread no matter where you think it's going, no matter how absurd you may think that path is going in your life. But here's the cool part. In verse 21 and 22, David ends this psalm and he says, I will wait for you. Redeem us. David is pointing towards something in the future. David doesn't come to his conclusions necessarily, but he has complete confidence. David doesn't necessarily have all the answers that he ever wanted, but he knows with a complete assurity that there's going to come something in the future that's going to redeem him, that he can wait for, and that makes him utterly confident in the path of God. And you and I, because we're on this side of the cross, David was looking forward, we can look backwards. That redemption came on the cross with Jesus. Jesus, by dying for you, do you know what he's saying here? Jesus is saying, if you are fearing failure in your life right now, why? Do you not know that on the cross, you are my poem that I wanted to die for? And I did. Jesus on the cross and through his resurrection says, what plan B for your life? What mistakes can you make that are infinitely bigger than God? None. What wrongs can you do? What bad choices in your life can you make that God cannot redeem? Friends, the cross is the only example of this. Every other God will say, if you make mistakes in your life, if you go the wrong path, fix it and then come to me. God says, you always take the wrong path in your life, but I will fix it. And the cross is proof of that. The best biblical example that I can think of as I close for this is Jacob. If you ever read the story of Jacob, here's the summary. He's a liar and a cheater. He cheats his brother, he lies about it, and because he makes those mistakes, he's driven out from his community. Hey, big guy. He's driven out because he makes those mistakes. But do you not see that when he makes those mistakes, when he's driven out, he meets Rachel, the love of his life. And because Jacob met Rachel, you and I, thousands of years later, get Jesus. God would look at Jacob and say, plan B, what plan B? This was my plan all along. Yeah, you messed up. Yeah, you made mistakes, but there's nothing that I can't fix. This is the freedom in Christian guidance. Is that when you and I, there is a path for you. You're a snowflake. You're a poem. There's a path. And God wants to tell you what it is, but ultimately the cross tells you, why do you and I fear? Why do you and I have anxiety when trying to make major decisions? Why? It's because we fear that ultimate failure. We fear that if we choose person B over person A, that something's going to go wrong. If we choose job A or job B. And God says, just listen to the guide. Take the map maker who died on a cross so that you could have ultimate guidance and a surety. David looks forward and he says, I will wait for you. Now, the best part about these Psalms is that these songs that we read, this book of Psalms, was always read in community. I don't have enough time to go through this. Psalms are communal. When you ask for guidance in the Christian life, you do not ask God alone. We do it as a community. We share with one another. We ask each other questions. We say, listen, I have a really tough thing in my life right now. I want your prayer. I want your guidance. I want your help. This is God speaking through the community. He spoke first through the cross, and now he gives us the community of God to get guidance. And so here's what we're going to do. Okay, you all have your pens, hopefully, maybe some of you have your pens. And if you have paper, we're going to do a little activity here. Normally we close with me praying, and we have a few minutes. Normally we close with a song. We're not going to do that today. I'm going to get really practical here. If you believe that Jesus dying on the cross means that your life has a path that cannot fail because he took failure for you. He took sin and death. He took the ultimate failure. If you believe that and you're free, let's start getting some guidance this morning. What I want you to do, remember I said at the beginning of the message, to think of that one thing in your life right now that you really want guidance on. That one decision that you just have a hard time making. I want you to write that down on your paper. Take a couple seconds and write that down. And maybe some of you need guidance. Maybe you have the path figured out. If you do, share it over coffee and donuts. We would love to have that. But for you who need guidance, you who have a question, write it down. Just write it down. We're going to do a little exercise. Now, after you write it down, what I want you to do is read Psalm 25 again. If you have a Bible or if you have your smartphone, I'm going to let you do this in silence. I'm going to let you have no music, no noise, just silence. I want you to read the psalm. I want you to be silent. And then I want you to write down the first 3 things that pop into your head. It could be anything. I don't care. First, you've written down what you need guidance on. Read the psalm. I'm going to let you be in quiet for a couple minutes. And then I want you to write down just the very first things that come to the top of your head as you pray about this.